Farah Swally came to Ireland in 1996. He came here under refugee status, claiming he was a Somalian and that his wife and family had been killed in the Civil War. He had no paperwork or passport as he had to flee his country. The actual truth was quite different. He came from Kenya, he had a wife and 2 children who were very much alive. He had heard about Ireland being a well-off country and they took in asylum seekers, and basically the government gave you money to do nothing. This to Farah seemed like an opportunity he couldn't resist. So when he arrived, he did just that. He sponged off the state and drank to his heart's content. While Farah was typically a nice guy, when he drank it was a different story. He became quite violent, especially towards women. When his citizenship was being reviewed, they discovered Farah's lies and he was set to be deported back to Kenya, but on appeal he was granted Irish citizenship in March 1999 because he was a father to an Irish-born son. He fathered 2 other children also. One of the mothers was a 16-year-old mentally disabled Chinese girl who he had met one night and brought her back to his flat. It was said this child was conceived through a sexual assault on that night. The girl applied for protective custody of the child and it was granted, but Farah did see the child supervised. This would come into play later on in the story. Farah was also in trouble with the law on several occasions, faced with charges of drunken disorder and assaults, 8 in total. He was convicted on 3 occasions but served no jail time. He was also a suspect in a murder of a 17-year-old girl who was stabbed to death in 1999, but his alibi checked out. So he had quite the history when he was to meet Kathleen Mulhall in 2001. Kathleen Mulhall lived in Kilclare in Dublin with her husband John. They got married young and were together 28 years in 2001. They had 6 children together, 3 boys and 3 girls. This was a very abusive relationship and alcohol and drugs were prominent among the family members. Kathleen on a night out met Farah in a nightclub and soon after she left her husband John and the family and moved in with Farah. Kathleen then took the unusual step of moving back into the family home with Farah in tow. This went down like a lead balloon with the family and they all moved out. But this did not last long and soon Kathleen and Farah were off to Cork City. They spent a number of years there but came back to Dublin, living in B&Bs and hostels, finally settling in Richmond Cottages, Ballybock, north of the city centre. Farah was extremely abusive towards Kathleen and it seemed she had traded one monster in for another, but they stayed together all the same. Linda was the eldest girl of Kathleen and John's children. She was 30 years of age in 2005. She had 4 children with her childhood sweetheart, and when this relationship broke down, she met a man that not only was abusive to her, but her children also. He would beat her children with a flex cord and seemed to enjoy inflicting pain on the children. Of course, drugs and alcohol were prominent in this relationship also. Eventually, Linda would go to the Gardaí, which in turn would involve social services, and Linda's children were put into the foster care system. Her partner got charged with the offences and was jailed. Linda was finally free from the abuse and moved back home to Kilclare in Tala. She unfortunately though went into a downward spiral with drugs and alcohol at the forefront. By 2005 though, Linda was somewhat getting her life back on track. She got back custody of her children and this seemed to give Linda new hope and want to do right by them. Charlotte, her sister, just 22, was troubled. She never worked a day in her life and was a bit of a drifter. She would disappear for months on end and then just show up at home and gone again. Her mother introduced her to sex work and often they would work the streets together. Again, like Linda and her mother, she suffered from alcohol and drug abuse. I suppose all in all, the 3 of them combined were a disaster waiting to happen. And on St. Patrick's weekend in 2005, in Dublin city centre, disaster would happen. A life would be lost and Kathleen, Linda and Charlotte would become judge, jury and executioner. It was Sunday morning around 11 a.m. and the day before Charlotte's 22nd birthday. Charlotte wanted to get into the celebrations early and begged Linda to have a drink with her. Linda wasn't that keen as she was spending the day with her 11-year-old son. But eventually Charlotte wore her down and she said she'd have one, which turned into two, and eventually all caution was thrown to the wind. Charlotte and Linda were having a buzz at home and enjoying their day when Charlotte got a call from Kathleen, their mother, to come into town and meet up with herself and Farah. Charlotte was all for this, Linda not so much, but again Charlotte worked her magic on Linda and they got ready to go into the city. They had fun trying on clothes and putting together their signature look of heavy black eyeliner and loads of makeup and drinking all the while. When they met up with Kathleen and Farah, they headed to the pub, but because none of them had jobs, money was tight. Farah went and bought a litre of vodka and soft drinks and they headed to the boardwalk along the River Liffey to continue their drinking. Everyone was in good spirits. Kathleen and Farah were getting on well, as were the girls. When they got there, Linda produced some pills. Kathleen, Charlotte and Linda popped them. They didn't give any to Farah as they knew he could get quite violent with drink, so they didn't want to add fuel to the fire by giving him pills. Over the course of 3 hours on the boardwalk, Kathleen, Charlotte and Linda popped 2 more pills each. As Farah was getting more drunk, he started to change and pick fights on Kathleen, which the girls didn't like. The mood was starting to change among the 4 of them, so they decided on a change of scenery, and the 10-minute walk back to Kathleen's flat might do them all good, and the party vibe could start again back at the flat. As they were heading up Dublin's O'Connell Street, Kathleen and Farah started arguing, and then Farah spotted a young Chinese boy and approached him, claiming it was his son, which it wasn't. The poor boy was terrified and Kathleen told Farah it wasn't his son and to cop himself on, and eventually Kathleen managed to drag him away. Linda saw this happen and got annoyed with Kathleen and Farah and stormed up the road away from them. Charlotte caught up with her and managed to calm her down. By the time they all got back to the flat, peace was restored and the partying began again. Music was playing and Charlotte and Kathleen got more drinks from the fridge. Unknown to Farah, Kathleen crushed a pill and put it in his drink. She wanted him on the same buzz as they were on. But soon Farah would start to feel the effects and his mood would change again. He sat next to Linda and started giving her the glad eye, touching her and whispering in her ear. Linda was not impressed and tried to remove herself from the situation. Farah was having none of it. He pulled her down on the couch and started to get very handsy. Kathleen and Charlotte noticed what was going on and tried to separate Farah from Linda, but he was a lot stronger and had a firm grip on Linda. Eventually they got control of the situation and Farah turned his attention to Kathleen. He started pushing and shoving her into the bedroom, threatening her. Kathleen was terrified and Farah had lost complete control of himself. Kathleen was so terrified of him, she screamed at the girls, "Kill him for me, please, kill him for me. I'll be dead within the year if you don't kill him." Charlotte was streetwise and a tough nut. There was no talking Farah down, so she decided to take action and got a Stanley knife, it's also known as a box cutter, came up behind him, grabbed his head back and slit his throat. Farah fell into the bedroom, tried to get up and Charlotte slit his throat for the second time, but he wasn't dead and Charlotte started to freak out. Linda ran into the kitchen, grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer, went back into the bedroom and rained blows down on Farah's head. The 2 of them continued bashing and stabbing Farah in the bedroom, even putting a pillowcase over his head at one point. Meanwhile, Kathleen went to the living room, continuing to drink and watch TV. She claimed she never heard anything or saw anything. To me, it gives new meaning to see no evil, hear no evil. She just let it happen and didn't care that her 2 daughters were essentially murdering her boyfriend in the next room. Eventually they stopped the frenzied attack and there was no mistaking that they had killed Farah. Realisation soon set in on what they had done. They cried, they hugged and then went into their mother holding hands, covered in blood, to tell her what they had done. Kathleen freaked out and started to tell the girls to get the body out of the flat. The question was, how? They dragged Farah into the bathroom. They rang their dad and asked him to come round. When he arrived, he took one look at the body and said, "I want nothing to do with this," and left. Linda sat on the toilet crying and shaking. She was falling apart, whereas Charlotte was more level-headed. Armed with the Stanley knife, hammer and bread knife, Charlotte started to cut up the body. While they managed to cut through the flesh and muscle, the bones became a bit of a problem. This is where Linda picked up the hammer and started to hammer down on the body, trying to crush the bones in order to separate the body into pieces. Stephen King's writings wasn't a patch on this scene of what went on in the bathroom. Eventually they cut Farah's legs off and tossed them into the shower unit. Then they started on his torso and all his insides fell out, and they were also tossed into the shower, eventually clogging the drain with all these body parts and fluids. After a while, on one of their breaks, Linda had thoughts in her head of how her mother had told her that Farah had assaulted her, and she bent down, took off his underwear and cut off his penis and said, "Now you'll never my mother again." It took 4 hours to chop up the body, and they managed to separate Farah into 8 pieces. The head was the most difficult as they had to separate it from the spine, so the hammer was put into use again. By the time they had finished, the bathroom looked like an abattoir. Now that the job was done, it was time to get rid of the body, but bin day wasn't until Friday, and this was only Sunday, and they couldn't risk leaving the body hanging around until then. So they got plastic bin bags and started loading the body parts into them. Then they got 3 sports bags that Kathleen had at the flat and put the wrapped body parts into them. Then cleanup began with Kathleen helping. In later interviews, the Gardaí would say that they went to the flat 3 times, and only on the 3rd visit they discovered blood because they did such a good job cleaning up. The next day was Charlotte's birthday, and it was a birthday that she would never forget. At 7 a.m, the 2 girls took the sports bags and headed down to the Royal Canal, which was about 4 minutes from Kathleen's flat, to dump the body parts. They did this on several trips throughout the day. The only parts they didn't dispose of in the canal was the head and the penis. The girls then took the bus to Tynan Park in Tala and buried the head under a bench and threw the weapons into the lake. 10 days later, on the 30th of March, the first of Farah's body parts would be discovered. A leg was found first, and it was thought to be a mannequin because it was still wearing a sock. Eventually more parts were found along the canal, and when this was announced on the news, Linda saw it and panicked and returned to where she buried the head, dug it up and put it behind some trees. She then returned later again, loaded it into her son's school bag, brought it to a field, drank a bottle of vodka and smashed the head once again into smaller pieces and buried it. She was so distraught with her actions that she apologised to Farah and said, "I'm sorry, it shouldn't have been you, it should have been my ma." When the body parts were recovered, they thought initially that it was a white male, but when the post-mortem was being carried out, they realised that it was a black man and that the water damage had taken the pigmentation out of the skin. Farah had 22 stab wounds to the neck and torso. The Gardaí found no ID on him, and so they put what he was wearing on Crime Stoppers, hoping that someone would recognise them. A friend of Farah's recognised the t-shirt as to what he was wearing the last time he saw him on the Sunday of St. Patrick's weekend. He immediately got in contact with Gardaí and identified the t-shirt, and told them about his friend Farah, and this in turn led the Gardaí to Richmond Cottages and Kathleen Mulhall. Meanwhile, Kathleen's 2 sons were in Whitfield prison on driving offences, and she had confided in her sons what had happened that Sunday in March. They went to the Gardaí and told them they had information of the murder of Farah. They looked for concessions on their charges. It was refused, but they did give unofficial information on what went on that day through a phone call, which was recorded. Linda was approached by the Gardaí and asked to meet with them, but she wouldn't at first. But eventually she did, and the Gardaí played the tape with the brothers talking about the murder. She couldn't believe that her 2 brothers, John and James, would do that to her. Linda finally started talking, and over the course of 4 days she told them everything, including Kathleen and Charlotte's involvement. A year and a half later, in December 2006, the two girls faced the courts on their own and were sentenced. Kathleen had done a runner to England but would return voluntarily in February 2008. She was arrested and held on remand, and in 2009 was found guilty of cleaning up at a crime scene, giving false information and impeding arrest. She got 5 years. She was released in 2011, and in 2018 she announced she had a terminal lung disease, but to this day she is still with us. She is living in England. Linda was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. She was released on good behaviour in January 2018. She had a relationship with an ex-prison officer who she met inside and claimed at one point she was pregnant for him. The prison officials never commented on this. They rekindled their relationship when she got out, but he decided to go back to his wife. She is now living in England. Charlotte was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. She has not been living a quiet life behind bars. In fact, she's a total nightmare. Charlotte has been involved in many incidents in prison. She was put in 24-hour lockdown for burning a fellow inmate with a curling iron. She has been accused of bullying and intimidation and having a lesbian liaison with a prison officer, and were actually caught in a very compromising position. In 2008, a picture was leaked that was taken on a mobile phone in prison. It was Charlotte holding a kitchen knife jokingly to a fellow male prisoner while they were on kitchen duty together. I know you are asking, what's the story there? Male prisoner. I had to look this one up. Mountjoy consists of male and female prisons on campus. If male prisoners are on good behaviour and deemed low risk, they are allowed to work in the kitchen of the women's prison. They are known as trustees. Since this incident, these privileges have been revoked. There was also an inquiry into the owner of the phone, which can add up to 5 years onto a sentence, but in reality it's usually only 6 months. Charlotte was moved to Limerick prison after the incident. This was highly embarrassing for Mountjoy prison, and no charges were made against her. Charlotte had a relationship with a fellow female prisoner in 2009, and they were engaged, but after the woman's release in 2012, she was found dead in her flat from unknown circumstances. On a side note, Linda and Charlotte were dubbed the Scissor Sisters by the media because of what they did to Farah. When they went to prison, they applied to the warden to set up a hair and beauty salon in the prison, and it was granted. They would do fellow prisoners' hair and makeup when they had appearances in court. They were the most feared inmates in the prison, and so I'd imagine they didn't get many complaints. As of February 2022, it has been reported that Charlotte has had numerous supervised day releases over the last while to visit family in Dublin. And if she stays on good behaviour, they will consider temporary release by the end of the year. This means that if she abides by the rules and restrictions put upon her, she may never have to return to prison again. The sisters and mother all blame each other for what happened and claim each had a bigger role in the murder of Farah. The head or the penis have never been recovered, and only Linda knows where they are, according to Kathleen and Charlotte. John Mulhall, Kathleen's ex-husband, committed suicide in the Phoenix Park after the girls were convicted. Farah was buried in Glasnevin Cemetery on Friday the 10th of March 2006 after Muslim prayers. The service was attended by 40 friends and members of the Gardaí investigating his death. His wife and children and extended family did not attend the funeral.